great to be speaking with you. And I think it's worth noting there were a couple of other panelists scheduled to speak here today, but I was saying I couldn't be more excited that she's the last woman standing because very, very relevant experience for the topic at hand. We're here to talk about the road ahead for turnarounds, restructurings, and insolvency with a focus on the Middle East. We can dabble in a few other jurisdictions, but you have, while you're based in the UK, your focus in your career has really focused on emerging markets, including the Middle East. So before we look at the road ahead, I think it's important to take a look at the road so far. Can you walk us through an overview of what the restructuring landscape in the Middle East has looked like and looks like today?
I think it is indeed very important to look at the history, and this region in particular over the last 10 years have undergone a number of reforms. We look at back in 2015, that's when the first insolvency regulations came out in ADGM. 2016, we see the UAE federal law, which is going to be repealed and replaced in 2024 in May with a new law that literally just came out. Then we see in 2018, and I'm looking at sort of the key markets in the region. In 2018, we see Bahrain and Saudi Arabia adopting legislation specifically to deal with bankruptcies. Then, obviously, COVID era, there have been a number of amendments specifically to address the emergency situation to introduce.
There we go. Easy. Okay. Go on.
A number of amendments to increase flexibility of the regimes to also deal with the emergency situation that we've been dealing with.
Done? Okay.
So I think, and all of those reforms have picked from either UK, US rules. Some of them, like the AFC, for example, picked from Sauvegarde in France. So they try to cherry pick the regimes that are really truly working in the world at large, and introduce them to create the market here. And I think one of the things, just to remind everyone, the target of the reform was sort of multifold, right? One of the things was to create a purpose-built tool for businesses to actually survive rather than end up in liquidation, which was the case before. And that meant that the legislation needed to introduce a variety of tools, some court-led, to allow those businesses to continue as a going concern. Interestingly, and this is very important for this market as well, is one of the targets that was aimed by the reforms is decriminalization of insolvency. There's still stigma attached to insolvencies in this area. So some legislation achieved that better than the other, but I think that was one of the key areas for developments. And again, at the risk of overgeneralizing, but in bullet point format, some of the other areas that we see in the legislation here is increased flexibility to raise interim funding, ability to deal with assets that are subject to security, because that could be a vital source of funding for a business that's undergoing restructuring, and also ability to efficiently deal with holdouts. So you're no longer restructuring in a situation where you need to get consent from every single creditor in your pool, but rather have certain regimes that are available to you to cram down the dissenting creditors. So this is kind of broadly the reforms that we've seen in GCC in particular.
In the past just 5 years or so.
Well, I think kind of if you look back to 2015, we're almost 10 years, but roughly the last 5 years, we probably have seen the biggest number of changes in this space.
I want to unpack Abu Dhabi a little bit more closely. I mean, we heard from Daniel Chapman earlier that beyond this being the capital of capital, there's so much more to offer and benefits to opening in ADGM specifically. Can you talk to us a little bit about what the regulatory framework looks like in ADGM and specifically compared to other areas in the GCC?
So I think it's probably important to take a step back and look at the UAE more broadly. UAE insolvency restructuring regime is very multi-layered. So we're looking at the federal law kind of applicable throughout the whole country, and then with the exception of the offshore regimes that are available in ADGM and DIFC. The federal law is civil law-based system. the ADGM and DIFC regimes are common law system. What's interesting about ADGM in particular is that, and it's unique as a system in that regard, is that it applies UK English common law directly. And when we look at the infrastructure around the system and the set of rules, you also have judges who have experience, and some of them are retired judges from English courts. So you bring in not just the fact that you can piggyback on the whole system of law that's been existent and developing over years and years, but you also get the experience infrastructure into play as well. In terms of the insolvency regime in UAE, bullets, because I don't think we're going to have time to educate everyone on everything available here. But looking at the UAE onshore, again, and piggyback on the restructuring and reforms that have been in the restructuring space and what they were targeting, we have first the PCP, so the pre-insolvency restructuring tool, and then you have bankruptcy proper, which kind of divides into two sections. You have rehabilitation proceedings that are available, or rescue proceedings available under the court supervision, and then bankruptcy proper sort of winding up if the rescue is not going ahead or is not available. In the IFC, again, you're looking at a very similar composition of tools available to you. So you have CVA, which is largely based on Sauvegarde from France. And then you have rehabilitation proceedings led through court, which is already a bankruptcy process, and then winding up if the rehabilitation doesn't go ahead. In ADGM, interestingly, and that's largely based on the UK rules, again, you have companies regulations with schemes of arrangement, which is largely based on the UK schemes of arrangement, and interestingly provides the same flexibility, and that's a tool that you can use pre-insolvency. And then you have administration with a twist, because in ADGM, the administration rules also allow you to enter into deed of company arrangement, which is an Australian tool. Frankly, it's not used in the UK at all, but provides flexibility that you need, and again, to deal efficiently with the dissenting creditors as part of the restructuring process. So that's largely kind of the overall picture that you see in the UAE. And ADGM sort of stands out, as I said, because of the common law aspect, and also because of the infrastructure that we have in place.
Well, I mean, let's talk about this a bit, what this looks like in practice, because you are on the team advising the restructuring of KBBO, and would love to hear about that, and also how it compares to NMC Health, which I'm sure everyone is familiar with, filed for bankruptcy in 2020, which was, I believe, a London-listed firm, but during COVID, courts weren't available, and so they actually filed for bankruptcy in the UAE, in ADGM. So walk us through that and kind of compare and contrast the two, and what the learnings were from each.
So I didn't work on NMCL, full disclosure, but obviously everyone heard a lot about that. And I think this audience as well had heard about KBBO and NMC ad nauseum right now, because these are the two cases that have been spoken about at length. And the reason for that is
they're paving the way for this.
A, they're paving the way. B, they're very public. And I think these are also the two largest cases that have been happening over the last 5 years in the space. So, and kind of, I will try and draw parallels with the targets that the reforms were aiming at, just to see whether or not in those specific practical examples, those targets were achieved. So KBBO started off in 2020, and initially it was contemplated to be a consensual restructuring under the supervision of FRC, which is prescribed by the federal law. Unfortunately, over a lengthy period of time, we did not manage to achieve a consensual restructuring. And I think the key complications in that case were, A, the sheer volume of creditor actions that were taken. So the accounts were blocked. The company just was not able to continue operating, because every single time they needed to make payments to their doctors, they needed to seek consent from the bank. And then the number of creditors involved, and then the need for liquidity. And again, in the FRC supervised process, there's just not sufficient flexibility in the rules to allow priority financing to be raised without seeking consent of every single secured creditor. And the situation with KBO was such that pretty much all the assets were subject to some encumbrances already. So you need to have some tool to allow that security to be trumped. And interestingly, on KBBO, initially we were considering migrating to ADGM, but at that point there was just not enough flexibility in the rules to enable that migration to happen. NMC, sort of very similar parallel timeline, but developed very differently. So you're right that the company was LSE listed. They filed for UK administration. After that, the companies that are based here migrated into the ADGM. There was a separate dispensation allowing the registrar to effectively get the insolvent company at that point into ADGM, specifically to allow them to file for administration here. And timing-wise, it developed relatively quickly. So 2020, they filed. I believe 2021. March 2022, it was resolved. So very quick timeline. Yeah. And if you look at KBBO again to compare and contrast, eventually, when the consensual discussions didn't end up anywhere, they did file in 2021, and the case was resolved in 2023 September. So it went through the court proceedings. It's interesting because I don't think that for GCC area, that timeline is actually particularly long. I mean, it's very short time space, and it's a development that clearly is an indicative of the reforms being successful. What other feature that I just wanted to highlight? So on the KBBO, as I mentioned, the interim funding or priority funding was critical. And interestingly, while the law itself was somewhat obscure on the ability to raise that priority funding, trumping the existing creditors' rights, the trustee went through the court proceedings and used the court discretion to approve that priority funding, using the kind of one line that the existing secured creditors' interests are protected. So there is some flexibility, but it's just not yet as transparent. We'll see what the new law says. I'm hoping that that issue has been resolved more efficiently, but clearly there is a need for more transparency in the rules so that people are more comfortable going ahead with the with restructuring on the basis of that. Comparing again with NMC, if you look at the ADGM rules as they stand right now, 2022, there is a specific provision dealing with priority funding that effectively allows the administrator to go to court and raise the secured funding if unsecured funding is not available at that point in priority or on a pari passu basis with the existing secured creditors if there's adequate protection for the secured creditors. And adequate protection could be deemed to be there if two conditions are met, right? First condition is that this helps achieve the purpose of administration, which is allowing the business to continue as a going concern. And the second one, that the existing secured credit is better off if this priority funding is raised, which very often is the case, because if you allow the business to continue as a going concern, it's more likely that the recovery level for the secured creditor will be higher.
I mean, it's a fascinating case study, and in particular because it really sets a precedent for what could be to come and how stable the market really will be, the infrastructure will be to support these going forward. So we don't want to wish more bankruptcies on any companies, but it'll be interesting to see how it rolls out.
Yeah, and I think a couple of panels ago, there was a discussion as to whether or not there will be distressed opportunities in the market. Yes, this GCC in particular is somewhat insulated. Higher oil prices, the influx of talent, displacement of some talent because of the events of last year, this year.
Balance sheets.
Exactly. Real estate market is booming because of the demand levels. Nonetheless, there will be restructuring cases.
What sectors do you see most vulnerable?
Well, construction is probably the one. And again, I'm not revealing any secrets here because it's been discussed before. In terms of road ahead, practice makes perfect, right? The more cases you have going through the system, testing the rules, testing the infrastructure, the more robust it becomes and the more trust the investors actually have that the restructuring regime works. I think it goes back to the point, having an efficient restructuring regime is not really for when the times are really bad. It's to create the right investor environment so that investors are comfortably coming into the market. Yeah. And I think the whole purpose of creating this restructuring hub, and I know I'm kind of speaking for Arvind here more than anyone, but creating this restructuring hub is also to create a healthy environment so the investors know that if events go belly up at some point, they have a predictable, transparent way of resolving the issues.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's most important. It's been what's most eye-opening for me in having these discussions, asking Polina what her outlook is for bankruptcies in the Middle East. And she's like, well, no, I don't really have an outlook for bankruptcies. I hope I don't see more, and I don't expect to see more, but it's more about, as ADGM and the region overall is so focused on attracting foreign investment and the growth of the region, is making sure that we have the right infrastructure in place to be able to support that.
That's right.
Switching gears a little bit now, away from the Middle East, but we have COP28 around the corner. Thursday, I think, is Sustainability Day at Abu Dhabi Finance Week. You recently authored a paper on the role of ESG and the role that it's playing across restructurings in kind of various ways, mostly focused on the UK and Europe. But I'd love to hear a little bit about that, and also what role you think it could play in the Middle East in, I don't know, 6 months, 1 year, 10 years.
I mean, ESG is a very hot topic everywhere, right? I'm not sure how hot it is here, despite the weather, but it is becoming super hot. And interestingly, we see more and more ESG subjects causing businesses to restructure. And that can come from different angles, right? The business is in a black industry, so it has to wind down for a variety of reasons. Say you have a conglomerate that has various businesses within the pool, and it needs to raise funding. One of the possible ways is to divest certain assets that are not critical for the business as a going concern. Now you have issues because if that business is in the black space, then you will not be able to attract the investors. We see a lot of increasing number of litigation cases, right, that effectively cause the business to then restructure. One of the examples is the Hawaiian electricity company, right? Because of the fires in Hawaii, now the company is undergoing distress at large. Again, all caused by natural disaster. So I think these trends will continue, and these are more business issues that are sort of inspired by ESG trends, but I think they are here to stay, and I think eventually they will come into this market as well.
Turning it over to the audience, does anybody have any outstanding questions for Polina before we wrap up with one more? Okay, I want to end on a high note. All this talk about distress and bankruptcy, let's be optimistic. What is the one thing that you're most excited about looking ahead in 2024?
2024. Every single year in January, you sort of plan ahead and things like this year is going to be the year of X and Y opportunities. It never quite works out that way. I'm actually hoping that 2024 is not going to see similar events that we've seen this year and last year in terms of wars and invasions, because those are massive displacements. And apart from creating opportunities for restructuring specialists and the like, I think they can create a lot of displacement in the market that, frankly, I would not love to see. So I'm excited for the new year because it's a new chapter. And I would really like there not to be these black swan massive events happening.
Well said, and I think we can all agree with that. Well, thank you so much for your time, Polina. Really interesting discussion.